Hey guys, the topic of this episode is quite personal for me. I'd like to share my thoughts with you regarding this highly sensitive subject. I'm talking about suicide and our often very judgmental opinions of it. The narrow minded view that I once held on suicide was based on a very weak understanding of one, the depression that drives people to do it, and two, the grace of a loving God. I remember the suicide of Robin Williams brought on the condemnatory aftermath of criticisms from some of the same people that you would hope to see showing the most grace. No, this wasn't true of all Christians, but it was done by enough to make the rest of us look pretty bad. Again, all it takes is a few oxymoronic, judgmental Christians who've forgotten the scriptures telling us not to judge others to paint the all too familiar, ugly picture of the church as a whole. So let's just get down to the meat of the matter, shall we? Why do some of us feel the need to automatically write off someone who commits suicide? What makes us assume that that person was weak-minded, selfish, or a coward? And why would we think he must have gone to hell for it? Now stay with me here. The truth is, until we are actually faced with a situation, we really don't know how we'd respond. Without ever knowing firsthand the kind of struggles a person like that is dealing with, we cannot possibly understand the extent of his pain. A few short years ago, this reality became very clear to me when a dear friend took his own life. He wasn't just a friend. He was a Christian. And he wasn't just a Christian friend. He was a young minister. A pastor of all people had committed suicide. How could this have happened? And how could I ever hope to make sense of it? This challenged some of my long-held beliefs as a Christian, and it devastated me to think that he might be in hell. Now, thankfully, a mutual friend of ours said something to me that made me consider another viewpoint. Then during the funeral, another friend made a statement that echoed that view. I began to re-examine my original stance and why I had believed it for so long. It was like revelation for me, and a bittersweet one because it had taken this tragedy for me to see the flaw in my thinking. Here's the thing. I had grown up with the idea that someone who commits suicide was committing the ultimate act of selfishness. I was pretty much told that exact thing by guidance counselors in high school. More importantly, I'd always thought that such a person automatically sentenced himself to hell. If a man's final act in this life, this was my thinking, if his final act in this life was to murder himself, which is a sin, then how could he be forgiven for that? He's dead, so it's too late to ask for forgiveness. Oh, but I could not have been more ignorant. Now, this friend of mine who committed suicide was clinically depressed. Being a Christian and even being a preacher didn't make him immune to such things. His struggles very often seemed too big to handle. The more private a person is and the more shut off from others that he becomes for whatever reason, and that's true of a lot of preachers, the more likely he is to keep his burdens to himself. Isolation had him on a bad road. That kind of depression is not something that one can simply snap out of. People who never suffer from it can't understand it. But if you're in it, it's a trap that smothers the life out of you, literally. You know something's wrong, but you think you have to deal with it alone, and you don't want to burden others with it. Your guilt from knowing how your behavior is affecting others is already making you feel worse. It's a condition that feeds on itself, destroying you from the inside. That's the sad part. That's the tragedy of it all. A person who feels isolated and overwhelmed, who ultimately comes to think that the only way out of this downward spiral of despair is the release from life itself. Death becomes the welcomed end to all the agonizing pain of depression and guilt. This is the tragic part that few people ever think about or want to think about. I think the real spiritual epiphany for me came in the form of a question. What kind of a God would deny his amazing grace just because of the last act of a desperate man? That was the game changer. Think about it. I had to admit to myself that the awesome and loving God that I serve is much bigger and more understanding than that. He's a God who exists outside of time because he created it. So I was mistaken in my linear thinking that there could be no forgiveness for suicide. The blood of Jesus is too powerful to be limited by time. It is how we live our lives that really matters. Furthermore, I believe that my friend's heart was right with God, even if his head was plagued with worries larger than life. And the stories I've read about Robin Williams lead me to believe that there's a very good chance that his heart was right with God as well. I will not assume the worst of these men, and by the helping grace of God, I will not judge them for their actions, because it's not my place to do so. Suicide is without doubt a tragedy. Is there a better way? Absolutely. For too many, however, it feels impossible to see a better way from deep in the hole in which they seem to live. I am not trying to make a case for ever considering suicide to be a viable option. It's not viable at all. But it is not for me or for any other man to say where those who commit this act will spend eternity. That is up to God and God alone. What kind of God would deny his grace because of the last act of a desperate man? That was the game changer.